When his undistinguished professorship was terminated in mid-1835, Gogol set out for the Caucasus, but lack of finances waylaid him in the Crimea. Between Kiev and Moscow on the return trip, Gogol indulged in some play acting suggested by the Inspector General, the comedy on which he was then working. He sent his friend Pashchenko ahead to spread the story that a government inspector, traveling incognito, was following. The stratagem was a complete success. At every post station, Gogol was met with great courtesy. And when he signed the register, quote, adjunct professor, end of quote, the station masters were certain Gogol was the investigating official. Danilevsky wrote, quote, of course, Gogol acted like a private person, but as if from simple curiosity, he would ask, quote, please, if possible, show me what kind of horses there are here. I would like to look at them, end of quote. Before, there had always been long waits for horses at each station, but this time Gogol and Danilevsky rolled along with no arguments or delays. Although anecdotes about travelers being mistaken for masquerading inspectors were not uncommon, and although the Inspector General bears some resemblance to Kotzebue's Die Deutschen Kleinstädter and Kvitko's arrival from the capital, it was Pushkin who suggested the play's plot to Gogol. Count Sologub, a minor writer, said, quote, Pushkin always called himself the godfather, end of quote, of the play, and Anenkov reports, it is well known that Gogol took the idea for the Inspector General in Dead Souls from Pushkin, but it is less well known that Pushkin did not relinquish his goods to him altogether willingly. In the circle of his friends, he used to say, laughing, you have to be careful with this little Russian. He fleeces me so that I can't even holler. Exactly how close Pushkin and Gogol were will probably always be something of a mystery. Gogol's servant Yakim said Pushkin would often visit Gogol and spend all night listening to his latest work or reading Gogol his own poetry. If he didn't find Gogol home, he would rummage through his papers to see what was new. Gogol wrote several rhetorical tributes to Pushkin, but his letters on Pushkin's death are curious schizophrenic combinations of effusive eulogy, cold everyday news, and requests for money. The tone of the few surviving letters to Gogol from Pushkin suggests Gogol was not among his intimates. The fox and the hedgehog do not live together. Gogol read the Inspector General and, quote, the nose, end of quote, at literary soirees in early 1836. On April 9th, Vyazemsky wrote, quote, Zhukovsky's Saturdays are flourishing. Only Gogol, whom Zhukovsky calls Gogolet, livens them up with his stories. Last Saturday, he read us a story about a nose which all of a sudden disappeared from the face of some collegiate assessor. Killingly funny, end of quote. The Inspector General, however, had snagged on the censorship, and it was played only after Zhukovsky took Gogol's case to Nikolai I. The Tsar read the play and uncharacteristically authorized its publication. Furthermore, he attended the premiere performance on April 19th with a number of his ministers and rocked with laughter. The reports about this first performance are strangely contradictory. Most of the witnesses say it was a great success, but the usually reliable Anenkov recalled that there was a good deal of silence, perplexity, and fear in the audience, that applause and laughter was sporadic and strained, and even those who did laugh went away grumbling, quote, it is possible, slander and a farce, end of quote. And after the performance, when Prokopovich presented Gogol with a freshly printed copy of the play and said, quote, admire your little son, end of quote, Gogol threw it to the floor and leaning against a table said, quote, my God, well, if only one or two had cursed it, end of quote. And soon after this, he wrote, the Inspector General has been played and my soul feels so disturbed, so strange. I expected I knew in advance how it would go, and nevertheless a sad, vexed, and painful feeling has enveloped me. My own creation seemed repugnant, bizarre, and as if it were not my own at all. From the very beginning of the play's performance, I sat in the theater bored. I didn't care about the rapture or the public or the way it received the play. Of all those who were in the theater, I feared only one judge, and this judge was I myself. Inside myself, I heard rebukes and grumbling against my own play, which drowned out all the others. And in general, the public was satisfied. Half of them even received the play with sympathy. The other half, as it usually happens, cussed it for reasons, however, which do not relate to art, end of quote. Bitch. Gogol praises the actor who played the mayor, but he says the main role, Klestikov, was completely lost. He curses Dobchinsky and Bobchinsky, the caricaturistic costuming, Man, that's a tough one. The caricaturistic costuming. The caricaturistic costuming. And the actor's stubborn refusal to heed any of his suggestions. Quote, again, I repeat, melancholy, melancholy. I don't know myself why melancholy possesses me, end of quote. And concludes, quote, my play repels me. I would like to run away now. God knows where. Western Europe was the answer. On June 6th, the Vyazemsky bid Gogol farewell, and thus began a 12-year period of European wanderings filled with loneliness, illness, and the slow, painful creation of Dead Souls, which he had already started to write. Between 1836 and 1848, Gogol visited Russia only twice, in the winters of 1839 through 40 and 1841 to 1842. The summer of 1836 saw Gogol pass through Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen, Dusseldorf, Aachen, down the Rhine to Mainz to Baden-Baden, then August through October, to the main Swiss cities. Finally, in the first part of November, he went to live with Danilevsky in Paris. There he moved in the society of the N.M. Smirnovs, A.I. Turgenev, and Mickiewicz's Polish circle until spring, when he moved to Italy, arriving in Rome on March 26. The Eternal City became Gogol's second home, and he was ecstatic about it. He spent most of the next several years there, usually wandering about the various German spas during the summer. Thus, we have the irony of Dead Souls being written in Vevey, Paris, Rome, and Baden-Baden. And so much did Gogol live within himself that one can find hardly a trace of Western Europe in Dead Souls. Perhaps he could have taught the impressionable Turgenev a lesson. A.O. Smirnova relates an interesting incident from the summer of 1837. Gogol announced to her and the few Russians with whom he associated that he was writing something called Dead Souls and would read to them that evening. Gogol arrived with his notebook, but as he began chapter 1, a terrific storm broke loose with thunder and lightning and cascades of rain. Quote, Gogol looked through the windows and at first seemed disturbed, but then calmed down and continued reading. We were in rapture. However, he didn't finish reading the second chapter and asked Karamzin to go with him to Graben, where he lived. The rain began to die down and they set off. Later, Karamzin told me that Gogol was afraid to go home alone, and to his question why, answered that there were big dogs in Graben and that he was afraid of them and didn't have a stick. There were no dogs in Graben, and I suppose that the thunderstorm worked on his weak nerves. He suffered those nervous sufferings which are known only to nervous characters. The next day I asked him to read some more from Dead Souls, but he flatly refused and even asked me never to ask him for that again. End of quote. In spite of such attacks of nerves, it would seem that the years 1837 to 1838 in Rome were among the happiest of Gogol's life. I.F. Zolotarev, who shared Gogol's apartment, said he was generally jovial and talkative, enraptured over discovering the beauties of Rome and showing them off to others. But simultaneously, there were signs of something else inside Gogol. Quote, in the first place, he was extremely religious. He went to churches often, and he liked to see manifestations of religiousness in other people. In the second place, a kind of stupor often possessed him. Suddenly, in the middle of an animated, gay conversation, he would fall silent, and you couldn't get a word out of him. This happened to him without apparent cause. Gogol also puzzled his acquaintances by the outlandish outfits he wore and by his stupendous appetite. He would go to a restaurant with Zolotarev and eat a complete dinner, but if a friend happened in as they were ready to leave, Gogol would order another complete dinner, stowing it God knows where in his skinny body. He displayed his own culinary prowess by preparing vast bowls of quivering macaroni and a goat's milk concoction, which he dubbed, quote, Gogol Mogul, end of quote. Among his acquaintances was Zinaida Volkonskaya, a Catholic convert, and her coterie of Polish friends and priests. Gogol learned to read Polish, discussed Mickiewicz's Pan Tadeusz and Zygmunt Krasinski's Undivine Comedy and Iridion, and he made the Poles and some of his Russian friends believe he was flirting with Catholicism. Apparently, Gogol was just trying to please the rich Princess Volkonskaya. Nevertheless, Gogol's considerable interest in religious questions is fully attested by the memoirs of the period. During the summer of 1838, Gogol traveled around Italy. According to N.V. Berg, Gogol gave this curious account of writing a chapter of Dead Souls. Quote, "Once in July, I was traveling between the little towns of Genzano and Albano. Halfway between those towns on a little hill is a miserable inn with a billiard table in its main room where the balls constantly clatter and there is chatter in various languages. I stopped there too. I was writing the first volume of Dead Souls at the time and never parted from my manuscript. I don't know why, but precisely at the moment I entered the inn, I felt like writing. I ordered a small table brought, sat down in a corner of the room, took out my paper case, and in the noise made by the rolling balls, the indescribable noise, the rushing about of the waiters, the smoke, the suffocating atmosphere, I became completely lost in a marvelous dream and wrote a whole chapter without moving from my seat. I consider those lines some of the most inspired. I have seldom written with such animation." Gogol's writing habits were indeed strange. On one occasion in Russia, Aksakov and Zhukovsky entered Gogol's room, ordinarily kept locked, unannounced, and saw him standing at his writing desk. Quote, "Before me stood Gogol in the following fantastic costume. Instead of boots, long woolen Russian stockings reaching above his knees. Instead of a frock coat, a velvet spencer over his flannel vest. His neck was wrapped round with a large varicolored scarf. And on his head was a crimson, velvet, gold-embroidered kokoshnik, very much resembling the headdress of Mordvinian women." End of quote. Gogol gazed unseeingly at the intruders for some time, quite unembarrassed by his weird costume. Others recalled that when Gogol locked himself in his room to write, they would often hear strange voices coming from there. No doubt Gogol's conversations with himself, his characters, and the mysterious gods of art. In the spring of 1839, Pogodin and Shevyev visited Gogol in Rome. Pogodin noted it was amusing to travel with Gogol because of another peculiarity, his extreme dislike of showing his passport or revealing his name. He often gave fictitious names like Gogol or Gonel. And when required to produce his passport, he would begin swearing at the customs or police official in Russian, but in a sweet and apologetic intonation which, accompanied by appropriately humble gestures, often made the Italian relent and let him pass. If the official persisted, it often turned out Gogol had secreted his papers somewhere in his luggage. Quote, "He would start to get mad, dig through his things without finding it anywhere, throw out everything that came to hand, and finally finding it where one couldn't expect any documents to be, began to curse the passport itself, asking it why it got stuck in there, and to shout at the policeman, 'There's the passport for you, eat it.'" End of quote. The Russian visitors made it a happy spring, but the mood was broken by the slow death of a young man named Yosef Volgorsky, with whom Gogol had just recently become good friends. Before he died, Volgorsky presented Gogol with a Bible inscribed, quote, "To my friend Nikolai," end of quote, which Gogol said was, quote, "doubly sacred," end of quote, to him. Gogol returned to Russia in September 1839 and remained there until June of the next year, living alternately with Pletnev, Zhukovsky, Pogodin, and the Aksakovs. Aksakov loaned him 2,000 rubles in November, Zhukovsky 4,000 in January. Unfortunately for his friends, Gogol's concepts of, quote, loan, end of quote, and, quote, gift, end of quote, had a disturbing tendency to overlap. Now he entertained by ritualistically preparing masses of macaroni and by reading the first 6 chapters of Dead Souls. Both activities elicited cries of rapture. He was received as a conquering hero. Thus, the Pogodins and Aksakovs contained their exasperation when he fell asleep or feigned sleep at soirees arranged in his honor. Most of his eccentricities were politely ignored, as, for example, when at dinner he would methodically tear off pieces of bread, roll them into little balls, and coolly throw them at the ladies and gentlemen around the table, or put them in his glass as a sign he was displeased with the beverage. His main purpose in returning to Russia on this occasion was to take his 2 sisters from school in Petersburg and lodge them in some wealthy aristocratic lady's house in Moscow, a task which he did manage to arrange. Gogol was an accomplished freeloader. He celebrated his name day on May 9th at Pogodin's. Among the distinguished guests was a young poet named Lermontov. He would be shot dead the next year, who read his narrative romantic poem, The Novice. Gogol spent July and August in Vienna, where a severe illness or attack of nerves put an end to a productive period and so terrified him that he made out a will. But in September, he returned to Rome, saying as usual that the open road was salubrious for him, and continued the final work on Dead Souls, which Annenkov helped him to copy in April to June 1841. Annenkov's memoirs give this picture of Gogol at the time. The smooth, shaven face and foppishly combed hair of Gogol's youth had been replaced by neat mustache and light brown shoulder-length locks. He lived almost ascetically. He was uninterested in politics. His reading consisted only of Dante, Pushkin, and Nietzsche's translation of the Iliad. He generally remained in a good humor. For example, he amused and annoyed his friends by playing card games of his own invention, constantly changing the rules during the course of play. Sewing was a favorite pastime. He was extremely fond of elaborate church services and religious processions. Annenkov says the only really disturbing thing was Gogol's sometimes morbid talk about death. For a while, he even slept on a divan just outside Annenkov's door, mussing his own bed to make the maid think he slept there. Because, Gogol said, he was afraid of death. In spite of this, he finished the first part of Dead Souls and in October 1841 returned to St. Petersburg, remaining in Russia until June 1842. The difficulties he had getting Dead Souls passed by the beef-witted censors are well documented by the letters which followed. After the Moscow censors refused to pass it, Gogol sent the manuscript to Petersburg with Belinsky. This was done secretly because Gogol did not want to antagonize his Slavophil friends such as Aksakov and Pagodin, people who considered Belinsky's westernizing politics anathema. Apart from the difficulties with the censorship, Gogol's second Russian sojourn was made unpleasant by quarrels with his friends, especially Pagodin. Besides loaning him money, Pagodin had lodged and fed Gogol, his sisters, and his mother on various occasions, some of them lengthily. So it was reasonable for him to expect repayment in the form of contributions to his journal, The Muscovite. But except for the fragment Rome, Gogol had nothing to offer. Though Gogol could be happy when Dead Souls was finally published 1842, he considered the last two volumes much more important, and he had been working on part 2 for over a year already. In these subsequent volumes, Gogol intended to show the good sides of Russian life, to introduce characters who should be emulated, and in the end to show Chichikov's spiritual transfiguration. Gogol maintained, and there is some reason to believe him, that up to then his main characters were objectifications of his own personal vices and shortcomings. These he could create with genius. But, he reasoned, he could not portray the good characters, the people who personify the moral excellence and the potential strength of Russia, until he had something of their virtue in himself. So he had to make himself better, to educate himself, to be reborn. And since he believed God gives the gift of artistic talent, religion had to play a fundamental role in the process of spiritual self-improvement. Although a bad soul could depict a dead soul, only a good soul could resurrect it. Before leaving for Rome, Gogol astounded the Aksakovs by announcing he intended to make a pilgrimage to the Lord's Sepulchre, which he would describe for them, quote, "But for that I have to purify myself and make myself worthy," end of quote. It was to be 6 years before he made the pilgrimage. Gogol then became a semi-mendicant troubadour of unsung songs. The winter of 1843 saw him in Rome and Nice in the company of the painter Ivanov, the poet Yazikov, and his spiritual sister, A.O. Smirnova, who provided an audience for his postprandial readings from Marcus Aurelius. Quote, "I swear to God," exclaimed Gogol, "all he lacks is being a Christian." And his beloved Nietzsche translation of the Iliad. The postmarks of his letters provide the tortuous itinerary of the next years. Seeking a cure for his ailments, he wandered despondently from spa to spa, from doctor to doctor. Biographers have always assumed that Gogol was a hopeless hypochondriac with a penchant for making mountains out of hemorrhoids. This was the opinion of most of Gogol's friends and of his doctors, but Gogol's friends were not physicians, and neither were his doctors. It is convenient to conclude that his pains were illusory, but I do not think we can exclude the possibility of some chronic organic illness, perhaps psychosomatic, which went undiagnosed and untreated. One suggested, quote, cure, end of quote, was bathing in the salt water at Ostend, fall 1844. There he took long, lonely walks by the seashore. He was taciturn and avoided most of the other Russians, which made them regard him as a haughty crank. He continued to work on Dead Souls, but in the summer of 1845, Gogol's anguished dissatisfaction with his manuscript culminated in another desperate act of literary pyromania. He gathered together and destroyed the drafts of Part 2, the work of 5 arduous years. Quote, Volume 2 of Dead Souls was burned because it was necessary. He will not come to life if he does not die, says the apostle. It is necessary to die in order to be resurrected. It was not easy to burn the work of 5 years, produced by such painful efforts where every line was achieved at the cost of violent agitation, where there was much that was my best thinking and interested my soul. But everything was burned, and at a moment when, seeing death before me, I wanted to leave at least something behind me, which would be the best remembrance of me. I thank God that he gave me the strength to do it. As soon as the flame had carried away the last pages of my book, its contents were suddenly resurrected in a radiant and purified form, like the phoenix from the fire. End of quote.